ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all in Johns Island again. I just want to thank Peter Brinkerhoff and Barry Sullivan for their wonderful hosting of this event, their hospitality to me and my colleagues, and so much of what they have done, and I want to thank so many of you who are here for all you've done for our mission at IWP, the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new to the Institute, I wanted just to give you a brief introduction about our mission. I once served in government in the State Department and the National Security Council, and I discovered that all sorts of people were doing jobs in government for which I thought they were inadequately prepared, and I considered myself to be in that category in some fields as well. I had been teaching at Georgetown. I taught there for about 15 years, and I tried to get Georgetown to adapt their curriculum accordingly, and they told me I would have an academic turf war if I tried to add some new courses in certain fields, particularly the different arts of statecraft. And so that's what prompted me to start IWP 28 years ago. We have a simple mission to help develop leaders who have a sound understanding of international realities, the ethical conduct of the different arts of statecraft, with knowledge and appreciation of the founding principles of the American political economy and the Western moral tradition. It's a four-part mission. International realities, what does that mean? Understanding foreign cultures on their own terms, not simply by mirror imaging and thinking that they're just like us. Understanding how they behave, understand their history, understand all of the fastballs and curveballs and knuckleballs that can be thrown at us in the world, and particularly behavior that exceeds the bounds of normal accepted diplomatic practice. And we seem to have that kind of thing all the time, whether it's terrorism, whether it's treaty violations, genocide, mass murder in failing states, whatever it may be, strategic deception, propaganda, perceptions management. And one of the problems of understanding the realities of the world is that it's sometimes hard to know if you're perceiving foreign reality correctly. And there are all sorts of impediments. I mentioned how mirror imaging is a problem. I mentioned propaganda, deception, fake news, disinformation, covert influence operations. Finally, these things have made the newspapers. We've been teaching our students about these realities for the last quarter century. Then there's all sorts of utopian thinking out there, particularly in international affairs. Some people think that if we just had a few more UN-type organizations and a few more treaties, a little bit better international law, and some more dialogue, that, gee, we'd all live in peace together. Some people refuse to acknowledge the existence of evil in the world. Some people think that you can march into Iraq and change it into a democracy overnight as if culture doesn't exist, as if the habits and the customs and the mentality developed over decades and centuries don't exist. Some people think that if we just get out of the world's face, get out of people's faces and withdraw from the world, that they'll stop hating us and all of a sudden we'll be at peace. And then there are some people who think that we can run a foreign policy just according to the national interest, the vital national interest, without interference from moral and humanitarian considerations. Well, I think that's another variant of utopianism, because you're not going to get rid of the moral sensibilities and the humanitarian chords in the human heart. So, and in the American heart particularly. So there are all sorts of obstacles. So if you don't study some of these things, if you don't study strategic deception and disinformation, if you don't understand how your perceptions can be managed by propaganda ministries and KGB trolls and bots and all of the other things that they're doing now to try to influence us. And it isn't just the Russians, it's the Iranians, it's the Chinese. This is a big contest in the information battle space to shape perceptions and attitudes. Then, of course, so how do you deal with it all? These are the arts of statecraft, the instruments of national power: military, diplomatic, peacemaking, public diplomacy, which means relations with people and not just governments. And that means everything from cultural diplomacy, which our government does, but which it totally neglects in spite of the fact that it is of strategic importance. There is information policy, international broadcasting. If you were to ask, during the Cold War, the great Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn said that our international broadcasters, the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty, were the most powerful weapons we possessed in the Cold War. Scratch your favorite foreign policy expert and ask him if he can explain what Solzhenitsyn meant and why he could say that radio stations were the most powerful weapon we had in the Cold War. The fact is that they were, and they were decisive in the victory over communism. But the foreign policy establishment in Washington, in my view, does not understand this, and the academic preparation of the people who man it does not consider these dimensions of statecraft. There is intelligence, there's counterintelligence, there's economic strategy in its many guises, there is cyber strategy, there's law enforcement. All of these are like instruments in an orchestra, and we want our students to learn how to play their instrument, but how it fits in the orchestra, and this requires integrated strategic thinking. We need conductors who understand what all the sections of the orchestra are, and we have conductors in our government for decades now who are inadequately prepared to understand that there may be a woodwind section or a double bass section somewhere in that orchestra that can be brought to bear before you start dropping bombs on people. We have a philosophy that if you use the non-military arts effectively in an integrated strategic way, you minimize the necessity of having to use force to defend our vital interests. We call it winning without war. It's actually an old concept. Sun Tzu talked about this 2,500 years ago, saying that to defeat your enemy without using force is the acme of skill. IWP, to my knowledge, is the only school in the nation that systematically teaches its students how to do this, which is one reason why the Army discovered us when they started to do counterinsurgency warfare, which involved things like winning hearts and minds and not just killing people in order to try to win these wars in which we've been embroiled. So they send their colonels and their strategists to us in lieu of going to war college. We teach our students about American founding principles. Why? Because I don't think that you can effectively represent or defend a country whose system you neither understand nor particularly appreciate. And there has been a precipitous decline in the study of American history and American government in this country. It's become a pandemic, and I think to the great detriment of our common weal. Finally, we teach Western moral philosophy and applied ethics. We teach students how to use power, and power, like liberty, can be abused. We want our students to use power ethically, prudently, responsibly, and that means they have to have contemplated what prudential moral reasoning is and how it's applied to the concrete use of power. We want to elevate the quotient of moral leadership in Washington. which has gotten, in my opinion, more corrupt in the 45 years that I've been living in that town. Anyway, that's our mission, and I want to thank again those of you who have been so generous to us. I'd love to invite those of you who are new to us, if you're interested in our cause, to take a look at some of the literature that we have on your tables, and we have some of our annual reports that are both on the table and on the back over there. And so that's basically what we're up to, and I just want to thank you all again for coming, honoring us with your presence. Now we at IWP have a unique student body and faculty. Our faculty are almost all scholar practitioners, people who have done what they teach. We have ambassadors, we have intelligence officers, military officers, people who've been involved in democracy building and foreign assistance in all sorts of different aspects of statecraft. And we have a student body, half of whom are recent college grads, and the other half are mid-career professionals from all over the place. We have 5 master's programs, and just this last fall, we launched, we just got approved our first doctoral program, a Doctor of Statecraft and National Security. It's a professional degree designed for people going into the profession rather than into the academic world. We just launched it in January, and we admitted 2 students. We actually 3, one has deferred, 2 have started. We're going to admit a couple more in the fall. And you're going to hear today from one of them, Brandon Weichert. Brandon is an extraordinary young man who has a number of years of experience in Washington under his belt. He worked for many years on a congressional staff. He has been active as an author, a journalist. He started his own website called the Weichert Report. He works as a contributor to the American Spectator and American Greatness. He's contributed to many other journals and periodicals. He distinguished himself at IWP in his master's degree work, so it was a natural for him to continue on for his doctorate. He has done cutting-edge work in the field of space policy, a whole realm of global competition, and you're going to be hearing from him next about this subject. It's a fascinating subject, and we're really proud of Brandon and what he's not only done, but what he will continue to do for our country. Brandon, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, John, and I hope I can live up to that. And I just want to say one quick thing about Dr. Linchowski. He's very modest, but he is one of the architects of the Reagan-era strategy for defeating the Soviet Union. His time on the National Security Council is very well known, and he's someone that I'm very proud to know for helping to defeat the Soviet scourge, and that I don't have to live in a period that is yet another, competition of communist versus capitalist. But today I'm going to talk, as he noted, about space policy. Now, when we think of space policy, we think of NASA. We think of some of the more interesting but maybe esoteric ideas of space exploration and taking the Hubble telescope, taking the really cool pictures of space. What we don't realize, as Dr. Linchowski mentioned, is that it is a budding arena of strategic competition. Now, back in the Cold War, it was still a new area, very expensive. The technology wasn't really quite there, so competition between the Soviets and the Americans was kept relatively muted. Obviously, the space race was a notable exception, but we didn't have an actual shooting war in space. We are living in a time today when particularly China has the capability, and they are increasing those capabilities, to at the very least threaten the very vital systems that our society depends on in space, notably satellites. And so today, what I'd like to talk about is how to counter the Chinese strategic threat in space. The Chinese are the government policy is one of what they call it counter space, but it is one of dominance in all areas. Some just a friendly competition. Some areas, like in space, potentially more. At the Institute of World Politics, when everyone was talking about the end of history in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the utopians kind of rose to prominence in the intellectual area of strategic thought, IWP hewed very closely to the classical concepts of geostrategy and geopolitics. There is a man that was required reading in your first semester at the Institute, Alfred Mackinder, and he was a British strategist who warned the British Empire in 1904 about the threat of a rising either nation or group of nations that would come to dominate the landmass that he referred to as the world island, but what we know as Eurasia, Europe and Asia, the contiguous landmass. And he said, who rules East Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, who rules the world island controls the world. And I think a similar concept can be brought to the 21st century vis-a-vis space. I like to say, who rules the air commands low Earth orbit, who rules low Earth orbit commands space, and who rules space controls the world. Geopolitics has returned, history has returned, and it is in the competition of places like space and cyber where we are seeing some of the most dangerous things occurring, and most people are not even aware of it. Most people are oblivious, maybe happily so. But the ability to threaten our space architecture is the ability to shut down modern society. If you pulled cash out of an ATM anytime recently, your signals likely traveled through space. They were relayed through a satellite overhead. If you got gas and you used your ATM card, same thing. Imagine the ability to disrupt our society by knocking out a handful of satellites and creating chaos here. Susan Gordon, who is currently the principal deputy director of the Director of National Intelligence, she said back in February at a conference, quote, China has the best politically supported and best resourced foreign space program that we have seen in many years. According to Dean Chang at Heritage Foundation, I saw part of this testimony when I worked on the Hill. He said space systems are judged to have provided, this was for the military, 70% of American battlefield communications, 80% of battlefield surveillance and reconnaissance, and 100% of meteorological data. And it did so through all weather conditions, 24 hours a day. Moreover, 98% of precision-guided weapons are guided with space-based information. Consequently, the Chinese plan on establishing, and forgive my pronunciation, Zhitianquan, otherwise known as space dominance, and it has become an essential element for achieving overall information dominance. You see, after Desert Storm, the Chinese were enraptured by the way that we sped to victory against what was the fourth largest military in the world. Saddam's army in 91 was using relatively modern technology, was a very sizable force, and was considered, many were fearful if we went to war with them in 91, it would end up being a bloodbath. And remember, Saddam was promising the mother of all battles. We used space warfare techniques very early, very premature, but it was space warfare. The Pentagon dubbed Desert Storm America's first space war because Schwarzkopf's famous left hook through the desert was conducted successfully when everybody said it wouldn't work in that desert. He took the tanks and outflanked the Iraqis. He did that by relying heavily on GPS satellites. And our reliance on these technologies has only increased. The Chinese were taking copious notes. They were in awe at how effectively outmoded their military was. And so they went to work, assiduously gathering the techniques and knowledge and technologies needed to counter the United States. And this all came to a head in 1996 during the Taiwan Strait crisis. At the time, it was assumed, I think by many in China, that they could basically push Taiwan around. And at the time, the Clinton administration, which 2 years before had made a deal with North Korea over their nuclear arsenal, I think many in China assumed in the government that they would get a similar deal over Taiwan out of the Clinton administration. Of course, that was proven wrong when the Chinese were firing missiles over Taiwan to try to intimidate them from electing a government that China didn't like. The Clinton administration sailed 2 aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Straits and effectively humiliated the Chinese. It would be akin to China sailing an aircraft carrier group, near here in Florida. It was humiliating. And so at that point, the Chinese doubled down and began a full-throated investment strategy and development strategy looking at cyber, economic warfare, space warfare, all the goodies, as I say, of modern warfare right there in China. And they have been assiduously building this capability up. Presently, after years of research, the Chinese have created they're CubeSats, so they're not that big and they're not that expensive. And these CubeSats, they're killer satellites. They're basically deployed into space. You can deploy hundreds of them from a single rocket. They have grappling claws on them. And in the event of war between the United States and China, the Chinese have the capability to latch on to our very expensive, very easily targeted satellites, whether it is intelligence satellites, military satellites, or civilian satellites. And they have the ability to physically disrupt the operations of that satellite by literally tearing the insides out. You see, since we lost our manned spaceflight program, we have to rely on the Russians to launch our people into space and to conduct, when we can, physical repair or reassessments of certain important satellites. Now, some of our satellites are too far for physical contact, even with the space program, but many of them aren't. Many of them are what's in LEO, low Earth orbit. We don't have that capability. That has withered on the vine. We are trying, it seems like, to get that capability back, but it's not that easy. You can't just flick your wrist and hope it to come back. And so the Chinese, meanwhile, are very well suited to counter our abilities to defend and repair existing satellite constellations. Something that the Chinese are well aware of is, in the event of one of our satellites going down, and they tested this in 2007 when they did a laser attack on one of our satellites nearby, passing over China. They lased the satellite with a blinding attack. It shut the satellite down for almost 24 hours. The only way we have to repair a satellite like that is to remotely, in one of the Air Force bases in the Midwest or in the West, remotely try to access it and restart the satellite. When a satellite is attacked in the way that it was, it tends to shut down its systems and turn toward the sun with its solar cells open. Basically, it wants to contain as much power as it can, but it can't operate. And so the Chinese don't even have to actually destroy the satellite because they know it takes time for an American ground operator, if he can even get back in touch with that satellite, to get it back up and running. Now, what could happen in that time? A 48-hour time gap. Well, Ian Watson just wrote an interesting book. He's a fellow at Project 2049, which is a think tank in DC that specializes in China. And he translated a series of pilfered documents from China's military about the most updated Chinese plan for invading Taiwan. The Chinese believe they need a 96-hour window. The penultimate year they keep referring to in the document is 2020. And so the Chinese believe that they could potentially take out Taiwan in a 96-hour period along the same kind of battle strategy that we used in 91 to knock out Saddam in the 100-hour air campaign. And they want to forcibly reunify by blinding our satellites that operate over the Pacific. Now, the Pacific is a vast territory, and so we need those satellites for what's known as over-the-horizon communication. By blinding that ability, they basically disconnect our people operating in Asia from the homeland. We are thereby completely caught off guard, and the ability to respond in a timely fashion to Chinese military aggression is thereby reduced. Now, the assumption, and I think this is a flawed assumption on the part of the Chinese military planners, but their assumption is the Americans, if we, the Chinese, can take Taiwan, whether it's by force or through other means, if we can take it in a relatively quick amount of time and have our flag flying over Taipei, the Americans will seek to negotiate. Now, I don't think that's an accurate assessment on their part, but this is something that I do know that several people that I know who deal with China, there is a contingent of Chinese strategists who really believe that. One of the notables is Colonel Lu Mingfu, or retired Colonel Lu Mingfu, who is President Xi Jinping's unofficial lead strategist. He is the guy who coined the term the China Dream. And the China Dream is President Xi's big push right now. He wants to basically, he says it's strong country, rich nation, strong country by 2049, which is the 100th year anniversary of the rise to power of the Communist Party. The interesting thing is it is a very openly militaristic policy. And the Chinese plan for space dominance plays a supremely important factor in these grand designs for making China a truly global superpower and potentially a dominant world power. Michael Pillsbury, who is a noted China scholar, previously out of Columbia, and now he, I think, is with he's with Hudson. He wrote a book in 2015 called The 100-Year Marathon, and he dissected the works in part of Colonel Lu Mingfu. And he is convinced that China has, whether it was an official conspiracy or if it was just kind of like minds on the Central Committee, over the last, since 1949, that they have been working assiduously toward a plan of reaching parity first with the United States, which Xi believes he can do in the next few years, maybe the next decade, and then eventually toppling the United States as the world hegemon. And space, again, plays a critical role. What is space? In military parlance, it's the ultimate high ground. If you control low, as I said, if you control low Earth orbit, you basically have the ability to place weapons in space. Now, I understand there are international treaties that supposedly ban this kind of behavior, but I would remind you all that China also is a signatory to the treaties that prevent annexing international water. And they have been annexing international waters for some period of time. And so this is the concern, is that the government there may be overreaching and that their policy and plans for space may mirror what's going on with what they're doing with the island building. So the killer satellites are a potential, and the blinding attacks, the anti-satellite weapon capabilities, which are basically very easy to build, very relatively low-cost missiles that can be launched by either a fighter jet or from the ground. They can track our satellites in orbit. Very easy to track our stuff in orbit. We track everyone's in orbit as well. It's not a hard capability. In fact, every year the Russians mock us. They publish the pictures that they take of all of our Lacrosse 2 intelligence satellites that are supposedly undetectable. And so they've been posting it on Twitter since about 2009 and 10. So it's not that hard to do, to track our stuff in orbit and either physically knock it out or blind it. And in that time period, you could have a Chinese, a breakout capability in terms of what they could take in their near abroad. The Chinese manned spaceflight program, there's a misconception. Many people believe that the world's spaceflight programs, ours is civilian, NASA. We separated it purposely from the Air Force in the 50s and 60s. The Chinese actually went the other way. They have reformatted their entire armed forces, and now they have, we all know about the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army Navy. They've also now created the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, which controls their nuclear missiles, their cyber capabilities, as well as space forces. And the manned spaceflight program is a part of the military in China. I wish we had a PowerPoint, because I have a picture of China's first spacewalk in 2002. A Chinese taikonaut is pictured holding a flag, Chinese flag, in space. Now, what people don't know about this incident, it was quite an international snafu. This picture was snapped by a cube satellite that the Chinese taikonaut released with his hand. And it spun around, took a picture of him, but then it did something else also. It started to take pictures of the American section of the International Space Station, which you're not supposed to do unless you let the US government know. So NASA's part of the International Space Station is a civilian project, but you're still under international law required to announce whether you're going to take a picture from space of our stuff. The Chinese did not know. We found this out after the fact. And the reason is they're testing their ability to use covert CubeSats for surveillance. This was in 2002. They've now intensified that capability to making it an offensive, not just a surveillance capability. The manned spaceflight program is also interesting because, and by the way, when I say manned spaceflight, I'm also including the rovers, the manned rovers they're using on the moon, the Chang'e 3. The Chang'e 3 is currently collecting lunar samples. The Chang'e 4, I believe, is going to be launched in the next few months. It was supposed to be launched last summer. There was a delay, but now they're going ahead with it again. This is going to actually, it's a larger rover, it can last longer, and it's going to collect samples of the lunar dust and bring it back to Earth for testing. The reason, it has long been, well, we know from our own surveys of the moon in the 60s that the moon is actually not a dead place. It is abundant in what we know as rare earth minerals. It's not so rare up there. There's one thing in particular the Chinese need more than anything to keep their growth going, and that's access to relatively cheap, relatively limitless energy. And this is why we see China investing heavily in all sorts of energy, the fossil fuels, but also in the alternative energy sector, particularly the nuclear fusion technology. Now, I know that people are very skeptical about this, but the Chinese aren't, and there's actually evidence. I mean, if you look at the way nuclear fusion technology overall has been expanding, it actually mirrors nicely with Moore's law for silicon computer chips, in that it's exponentially increasing, the capabilities are. The Chinese are big believers in nuclear fusion as a long-term, clean, sustainable alternative energy source. There's the known way of doing nuclear fusion, which is relying on deuterium-tritium reactions, but there's actually a more efficient, less radioactive, therefore less dangerous method, relying on helium-3, which is an isotope. It is not found in abundance on the Earth because it is created by solar radiation, and our atmosphere deflects 80 to 90% of the ability to create helium-3 in the Earth. However, a place like the moon does not have an atmosphere, and it is suspected that helium-3 is in abundance on the moon. A canister of refined helium-3, it is believed, used for nuclear fusion energy, or to fuel the reaction process, has the potential to provide energy. A canister of about that big has the potential to provide energy for anywhere from 15 to 20 years without needing replacement for a city the size of Manhattan. And it's completely clean. Now, this technology is in the early development, and so I don't want to sound Pollyannish here, but as we've seen with China's rise in general, big things have small beginnings. And the Chinese have a very different view, speaking about what JL talked about trying to look at the world through the cultural lens of another culture. The Chinese leadership does not view things in electoral cycles the way we do of 2 and 4 years. They also, for the business side, as we've seen with Chinese state-owned enterprises, they don't view things according to the quarterly report or the bottom line. They view things in a long count, strategic way. Everything in China is being integrated into the overall Chinese state system. And so when it comes to space exploration, they are very open about the fact that this is not just for scientific gain. There is no divide in China between a civilian space program and a military one as exists in the United States. There is a full integrated effort to dominate space militarily for the satellite purposes in the near term. But in the long term, the Chinese have every intention of going to space for economic reasons. And this is critical because obviously it's the economy, stupid, right? I mean, that's the old saying. So there's a geoeconomic component to space that no one really talks about. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the preeminent physicist, he said that, quote, there's this vast universe of limitless energy and limitless resources. He says, I look at wars fought over access to resources. That could be a thing of the past. Now, I think that might be Pollyanna-ish, but whatever. He says, once space becomes our backyard, the first trillionaire with a T that there will ever be is the person who exploits the natural resources on asteroids, the natural resources that are on Earth and common on that are rare on Earth and common on selected asteroids. So the Chinese century, if that is to be a thing, I think is inextricably linked to space development. Now, I've done some work with Silicon Valley, and I've kind of seen up front some of the developments going on there, obviously in the general tech sector, but specifically in the space sector. But there is something going on, and this gets back to the integrated nature of Chinese statecraft. Because obviously with space grew, our ability to operate in space and to use space grew predominantly out of kind of a military end. Initially, it grew from rockets, the ability to launch things into space and have it come back and blow up a target on Earth. And eventually it evolved from the nuclear discoveries as well. But the thing about technological innovation is that it's nonlinear. It happens kind of in this amorphous soup. And some things take off and then build off other things, and some things that you would think would take off don't. And so one thing that we're looking at is the quantum internet. Now, quantum internet relies on space. The Chinese 2 years ago, and still in orbit, and it has passed every test they've done, launched a revolutionary new way of communications. It is based on quantum computing technology, which is the next wave of it's the next computing revolution. And the Chinese have gotten there first. Now, IBM and the Canadian company is doing the D-Wave. They're heavily into it for economic reasons, but the Chinese are into this for strategic reasons, which is why, whereas the American companies are still on the drawing board researching, China physically deployed this thing, and they're doing live tests right now. The Messias satellite is orbiting us right now. And according to KPMG, which is a global consulting firm that deals with the tech sector heavily, they do their quadrennial Tech Innovation Hub survey, in which they interview anywhere from 800 to 1,000 of the world's leading tech gurus, and they ask them to rank the next top 10 innovation hubs. Will it continue to be in the United States? Will it go elsewhere? And what the study from April of 2017 discovered was that, quote, China is now closing the gap with the United States in leading the development of disruptive technology breakthroughs. These industry leaders also identified Shanghai, not Silicon Valley, as the city that will rival San Francisco, along with California's Silicon Valley, as the world's leading innovation hub over the next 4 years. The innovation economy in China is being energized by the technology disruptions that are occurring. What we've seen emerge over time is the result of countries and cities striving to replicate and build on Silicon Valley's tech innovation blueprint and their increasing degree of success. This is according to Tim Zanni. He's the global and U.S. head of KPMG's tech, media, and telecommunications practice. China is eating our lunch now in the tech innovation. People still talk about Silicon Valley, but if you listen to people like Peter Thiel, they're already moving around. I mean, Peter Thiel just moved his operations to LA. He's encouraging others to go elsewhere. Google has operations opening up in Tijuana. They're revitalizing Tijuana. And notably, Google is opening, and the KPMG survey listed Shanghai, Shenzhen, Beijing, and either Guangzhou or Guangdong. There's a fifth one in there from China. America still has, obviously we're still in the top 10 as well, but it's really amazing. 10 years ago, Shanghai looked nothing like it does today. It does not have the kind of investments into the knowledge economy. Because remember, we were told in the 90s, don't worry, they're just going to take our blue-collar manufacturing jobs, the low-paying stuff, the jobs of last century. We're still going to have a capital on the white-collar, knowledge-based, innovative industries. That is not true. The Chinese have, for the last 15 years really, been transitioning away from the manufacturing industrial model, ever so slowly but efficiently, into a more knowledge-based economy to compete and eventually displace the United States in the 100-year marathon, economically, politically, and militarily. And so what we're witnessing is, particularly with quantum computing technology, basically it works on quantum entanglement, which is when a particle is able to exist in two different places in the universe simultaneously, and you go in and you manipulate those particles at the subatomic level. Data can be relayed at instantaneous speeds regardless of distance, and it is virtually, if you'll pardon the expression, unhackable. Einstein first discovered this in the 1930s when he was manipulating things in his lab. He referred to it, scared him. He called it spooky action at a distance. And the Chinese are mastering this, and they are investing. And by the way, as I said about innovation, how it kind of just evolves in a fluid fashion. From the quantum internet investment, they are now doubling down on their investment in, it's in a province, and I can never say it properly, it's H-E-F-E-I, Hefei. Okay, yes, yeah, they're doubling down on their investment in a full-throated People's Liberation Army run, 37 hectares, nearly 4 million square feet, $10 billion research center, the National Laboratory for Quantum Information Sciences. It's going to open in 2020. 2020 is a magical year for many of the Chinese planners across the board. They were going to research quantum metrology, build quantum computing for the military and national defense purposes, and then there's a $100 billion SoftBank Vision Fund, which is scouting for possible investments in quantum computing and experimental science being researched by companies such as Google and IBM to succeed current computer processing tech because we're reaching the end of Moore's Law. And with 3D computing chips, it's still not enough because there's a lot of heat dissipation problems. And so China's got a leg up on us, and they're doubling down on this investment. From that investment, they were able to develop rather rapidly the quantum internet, very rudimentary, but again, big things have small beginnings. And now they're going into quantum radar. Now, we just spent over the last decade almost $1.3 with a T trillion over the last decade on the F-35 program. It was billed as America's ace in the hole, the fifth generation warplane that was the warplane to end all wars. And for a fraction of the cost, China has developed the quantum radar, and they're marrying it up to Russia's S-400 air defense battery system, which is capable of hitting our F-35 already. But they're marrying that system up with their quantum radar technology, which has the ability to see all existing stealth planes. And they've been testing it for about 3 years now. And so for a fraction of the cost, not only do they have a way to counter us, but they also are now invested in an innovative way, in this quantum computing revolution that will allow the Chinese government, because remember, most of the industries there are state-owned, the Chinese government to dominate the information sector on the civilian side. In space, quantum computing is going to be hugely important for a retinue of operations. And so, again, space is part of a larger integrated strategy, economic, cyber, computing, all of it, so societal, political. It's all part of a larger picture. According to the futurist, he's a Tribeca Fellow, and he's the CEO of AMIX. He said that once quantum computers gain traction in the mainstream industry, they may become the biggest threat to the current industries and markets worth many billions of dollars. Alternatively, the potential of a fully functional quantum computer is so vast that one commercially viable quantum computer in production can unleash a havoc by creating a revolution more significant than the Industrial Revolution of the past century. The breakthrough in quantum computing has given China the lead in the highly competitive world of computing. Keeping the future in its sight, China is investing heavily in intellectual property and its development, which is a wise decision given the country has a fast emerging market. And by the way, Google and Apple are now investing significantly in helping China develop those capabilities. And as we've seen with the manufacturing companies of old, in order to do business in China, you've got to open up your company's vaults and give the secrets to the Chinese government, who slowly build your competitors indigenously. And the same thing is going to happen with Google and Apple. And all of this is going to support the overall Chinese push for strategic dominance, which President Xi envisions hitting us around 2049. If all goes according to plan. Of course, the best laid plans, cross your fingers, I guess. There's another thing that, because people ask me, well, this space mining thing, the problem is they don't have the capabilities to bring the stuff they harvest from these celestial bodies back to Earth in a cheap, efficient manner. Not so. The EM drive, electromagnetic drive, is called the Impossible Drive. It was developed by Roger Scheuer in 1999 in the UK. Everybody laughed this guy out of the room, so he sold his design to China in 2007. The Chinese have sunk a massive amount of money into this project beginning in 07-08, and NASA Eagle Works Lab is now hurriedly trying to catch up, but their system is not as efficient as the Chinese system. An EM drive-powered ship or satellite could get to Mars in under 10 weeks as opposed to a year. That's just for exploration. Now, if we're angling to either capture asteroids or to go to the moon, it takes on a regular rocket about 72 hours to get from the Earth to the moon. We can probably get there in a few hours on the EM drive. The Chinese have a new space station they put into orbit, the Tiangong 2 Heavenly Palace. The first one is set to crash into the Earth in the next week. So I hope you're all insured because we don't know where it's going to land yet. The second one, though, is more stable and more robust. They're testing a weaponized laser system on the Tiangong 2 as well as the EM drive. This is something that you're not going to hear in the press, but I have heard from friends of mine who work for various agencies that the quiet opinion among many people is that, in fact, China is testing the EM drive currently in orbit. We, as of October 2016, late to the game as always, the UK and US are now investing in a joint venture to try to acquire the EM drive for military satellites and for potential space planes and other equipment. This, again, though, we are about, 10 years now behind China in this very critical area. Again, it cuts down cost. So that's very important for space, because the one thing holding everybody back has been cost. But now technology is progressing to such a point that cost is becoming a more manageable effort, especially when you look at the potential returns. Speaking about resource scarcity, there has been a series, Brahma Shalani, he's an Indian researcher. He wrote a book called The Coming Water Wars. And he basically researched from 1947 until 2007 all of the world's great conflicts. And he found that many of them were centered around places where there was water scarcity. Now, what are we witnessing in the world? Last summer, people don't realize this, in Doklam, the Chinese and Indians almost went to war over water rights to the Tibetan Plateau. In Egypt, presently, there is a very real potential of a shooting war between the Egyptians and the Ethiopians and Sudanese over water rights to the Nile. These things are happening. Space could potentially allow us to create an alternative because there is a lot of mineable ice on the asteroids, on the moon, and if we have the capability to reach the outer planets, there is an entire water moon called Europa. The whole thing, it's like something from Star Wars. It's a layer of ice, and it's believed there's a large ocean beneath it. This could be one way, whoever is able to figure it out, that long term, we could potentially offset any potential water scarcity issues. If you've ever been to California or you know anybody in California like I do, you know they're having water scarcity issues. I know when I went to school in Chicago, in 2010, the big protest movement was we're not going to let the western states mine or drill for water and bring it out from Lake Michigan to water-starved California. And the Canadians also stepped in at that point and said, well, we draw from the Great Lakes, so no, you're not going to drain them for the western United States. And so there is a very serious issue of water scarcity that could be offset potentially by the investments we make over the next decade into space mining capabilities. And toward that end, I don't know if you're familiar with a guy named Dr. Michael Burry. He was one of the guys who predicted, he shorted the markets in '08. He's a very interesting guy. Christian Bale played him in the movie The Big Short. He believes, after having made big bucks off of shorting the market, the real estate market, he now thinks that, if you'll pardon the expression, water is the next bubble. And we're already witnessing the geopolitical instability throughout Eurasia in particular because of water scarcity. Investing now in the technology and economic capabilities to reach space and begin mining could potentially be a significant help. Insofar as the American response, I'm just going to wrap it up in about 5 minutes. President Trump reconstituted the Space Council, which was disbanded over the last decade. The vice president is heading this. It had its first meeting in February. The only real upside that I see with the omnibus spending bill was that it did increase spending for military space operations by 33%. But unfortunately, the Pentagon is fighting this, but I have argued in the press that we absolutely need a fifth branch of the military, a Space Corps, dedicated solely to space operations. We cannot leave it relegated to the Air Force. They are not going to source it properly. They don't have the long-range vision that China does for space. Some American space weapons that they're talking about are space-based missile defense, known as Star Wars, to help us counteract. I mean, we know from the 80s. The technology has finally caught up where we can actually start doing this. The Chinese are investing in it. The Russians are deploying a system, very rudimentary, but a space-based anti-missile defense system. The Air Force wants to deploy what's known as rods from God. And this is giant tungsten rods with no ordnance on them whatsoever. They rely solely on gravity. You put them in the strategically higher orbits, and that way when North Korea decides they're going to launch a nuclear missile at Hawaii, well, not only do we have the ability to detect that, we have the ability to launch from space. Our space-based defense systems could intercept that launch, and then the tungsten rods launched from orbit could pummel Pyongyang into next Wednesday. Instantaneously. No need to risk a pilot. We can just do it from space bombing. They also talk in the Air Force a lot about, you'll forgive the term, battle stars, which are basically, they're literally manned satellites. Now, this was the concept the Air Force pushed in the 50s and 60s, known as the Manned Orbital Laboratories. It was ultimately nixed by Nixon on the eve of its launch for various reasons, but had they gone forward with the MOL program, we would have right now an entire ecosystem in space of human capabilities, military capabilities, and I believe we would not have the threats we're having today, but whatever. So they're talking about reconstituting some form of this program and putting actual Air Force or eventually maybe Space Corps officers, astronauts aboard these things, because we know our enemies don't mind taking us out if there are no Americans threatened, like China or Russia. But if American troops are threatened, they're worried about the crisis of escalation. So by having people on a manned satellite, that could be armed as well, you're also reducing the potential that there will actually be a shooting war in space. And then, of course, there's talk of using CubeSats for defensive satellite purposes. Basically, the argument is they could be deployed to jump in front of a critical satellite as a missile is headed toward it to deflect the missile. The problem with all of this is what's known as the Kessler syndrome, which is basically when you blow something up in space, you create a sea of debris that moves along at super speeds and are like little bullets. If anybody has ever seen the Sandra Bullock film Gravity, you should, because it's a great detail. Basically, the movie is Putin launches an anti-satellite test while our astronauts are in orbit, and it creates this whole crisis, and it takes out the world's communications, because it creates a ricochet effect where literally it's like a cascading impact on all the world's systems. Now, NASA has a way of stopping it, but the Obama administration cut funding. They wanted to put a laser on the International Space Station and literally use it to push the debris out of the way. But it was worried that the Chinese were saying that it constitutes as a space weapon, and so there was a lot of diplomatic pushback. I think that we could easily enact that program today at very low cost. And I'm probably going to end it there. I've got more, but we can do a Q&A if you want. I don't know if that's Barry. Thank you.
I think maybe you can understand now why characters like me, who frankly have very little understanding about what you've been talking about, are so proud of John's ability to train people at this level. And I'm happy to say that our government is ignorant in a lot of ways in what you have been talking about, but maybe are starting to learn that catch up is not just a requirement, is a necessity. And I think I've told you a couple stories about these cyber security and warfare conferences. And as I say, all I can tell you is that the business with Facebook that just has come out, I don't think 90% of the people in the world understood that there was a way people could use big data and mine all of the information that just goes through Facebook every day and use it for a purpose. You know, welcome to the real world. You know, this is going on. And all I can say is that this guy is great and his knowledge is deep and he's not unique. And John's been turning out people like this for some time, starting a very small base, but now we're at, what, 140 students, something like that? 150? The one thing I'd like you to remember is that while Brandon sounds like he's a military guy, he's not. This government of ours doesn't put 10 cents into this institute. We are totally dependent upon the largesse of our country. Yes, tuitions pay some of the freight, but these guys are all going to work for government. And I can look at people that have all gone to the fine universities of our country and made a killing and been kind enough to send some of it back to where they learned their trade. The government doesn't ever pay this kind of wage. And so that's why we're having this group. You know, John Higgs has been kind enough, and Stephanie Smith, to have John Chasky speak here 3 times in the last, 15, 20 years. And we would love to have much more community support because our government isn't helping these guys at all. They might employ them, but they're not going to fund them. They're not going to back them up with capital. And so you have to figure out a way to get trained pretty much on your own.
It's all, yeah.
And I'd just like you all to keep that in mind, and thank you so much
for
coming today. And if there's questions, please.
I'm
feel
open.
free to ask them.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
This is going to sound like a ridiculous question. What keeps you up at night?
Well, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old at home, so they pretty much do. And aside from that, the space stuff, if you had asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have said our space, lack of understanding of what's going on above our heads. But today there's been a series of developments in the last 24 hours that relate to China. China just started trading as of yesterday in Shanghai. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia allowed them. And this is the beginning of a larger, and we talked about this, this is the beginning of a larger program to start trading oil according to the renminbi, the yuan. And this is and it went gangbusters. They basically underestimated how well it would be traded on the global market. And it is the beginning of China's final act of displacing the United States, because our ability to spend, and this is a bipartisan issue, I think our government spends way too much money and they don't have any way of paying for it. $21 trillion debt. I think it was Hank Paulson who said that the Chinese finance minister in 2008 turned to him and said, Hank, your country's debt is the biggest national security threat you face. And the dominant position of the dollar, because oil is traded, or was, according to West Texas futures, That is the thing that allowed the Fed to print the money, to allow for all of the spending to go on. Now that's being called into question. And this is not a blip. The petro yuan is a thing. It is here to stay unless, China collapses. But I'm moving forward as if that's not going to happen, because that is dangerous to assume that. So that keeps me up at night. And then my friend just sent me an article before we started, and again, we talked about this at the table, in response to what's going on with tariffs and in response to what's going on with I think the nomination of Bolton plays heavily into this. China just conducted their largest naval exercise in history, well, modern history at least, off the coast of Henan Island, which is their big naval base. The Liaoning, I think I'm saying that right, their aircraft carrier was part of a flotilla of 40 warships that sailed very close to R2 destroyers that are currently conducting freedom of navigation operations. This is part of a larger effort. This is what I was talking about in my talk about space. It's not just space. See, we kind of put things into silos in terms of policies. We look at, well, space is one policy, economics is another policy, political affairs. It's all integrated. And so if you're asking what my immediate concern, it's the economic. Because so much of the damage economically that we've experienced, especially since '08, has been self-inflicted for the most part. And our enemies, the old creed, if your enemy's going to kill himself, give him the gun. And so the Chinese were more than happy to suborn our egregious spending when they were helping with our debt. This was all part, I believe, of some loose strategy on the part of senior people in China. The hope, I think, on their part was that we would do exactly what we were doing, is we would do what the Soviets did. Spend ourselves into oblivion before China has to even fire a shot. This gets back to Sun Tzu. And that plays heavily into space, again, because space is really expensive. And the Chinese are flush with cash right now, and they're investing accordingly, and they're getting Western firms to invest in them. That's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You worry about an EMP attack?
Yeah, so when I worked on the Hill, it was right after the EMP commission. It's an electromagnetic pulse, which basically, when a nuclear weapon is detonated, it emits a pulse right before detonation that knocks out all silicon-based computers or chips, fries them. And this was discovered in the 60s. The Soviets did a test in the atmosphere of nuclear weapons. This is actually what led to the Test Ban Treaty. And they found that it has these effects. And it's very expensive to harden our systems against an EMP. What the science community managed to do over the 50 or 60 years was to basically create a weapon entirely of EMP, devoid of the nuclear fallout, just the EMP. So it doesn't actually physically kill you. I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be standing next to it if it went off. But I don't know what it does in terms of the biological impact. But it completely fries all advanced systems. And anything that's based on silicon chips is gone. And we know the North Koreans, Jim Woolsey, who was the chancellor of IWP for a period of time, he and I talked extensively about this. His concern, and it sounds fanciful, but it's not. The North Koreans have been conducting several satellite launches. Now, the North Koreans they don't have a space program like we understand it. They don't really even have the capabilities to do really much of anything. And they said they were putting communication satellites into orbit. Well, when we looked at them and we analyzed them, they're up there, but they're dormant. They are not transmitting anything. But what they do is they cross it's the KPM-2 Korean satellite that was launched last April, or 2 Aprils ago. No, last April. And it crosses the terminus of America's East Coast energy hub. The big power grid hub that feeds most of the country. And if this thing is detonated 50 miles or higher above the continental United States, it can knock out all power, all silicon-based, anything that has an on switch is gone forever. And we're thrown back into the, well, frankly, North Korean level of development. And Jim Woolsey said this, and he wrote an article in National Interest about this, and I agreed with him. He said that it is possible that they are launching EMP bombs dormant in orbit, and when they have enough of them crossing orbits of the advanced Western countries, little Kim is going to pick up the phone and say, "Hey, Mr. Trump, I'm literally holding you hostage. Give us South Korea and whatever else we want, or we're going to send you back to the 18th century." The EMP Commission determined that in 2 years of an EMP detonation over the United States that debilitated anywhere from 80% of our capabilities, 90%, 92% of the population would either be dead or dying in the United States within 2 to 3 years, because it would take about 5 years to get the infrastructure back up and running. That's not to say that we could do it in that time, because if we saw what happened after Katrina, you'll have mass riots, you'll have like Mad Max at the Thunderdome going on, which is going to stall the ability to repair the damage, to say the least.
Jim Woolsey mentioned to me, he said that most of the people would be starving to death,
Yes. Yes.
which is an incredible statement. Next question.
Yes.
Sir.
You mentioned the short-term threats to Taiwan, and this is a short-term question rather than the long-term question you were talking about. All the things that you mentioned the Chinese could do to us and to the Taiwanese, couldn't we do exactly the same thing to them in exactly the right amount of time?
The timing, I would argue, we thankfully, the one upside of this omnibus bill was the 33% increase in military space spending. Why was that much needed? Because for 25 years, we've not been sourcing those capabilities. And so we are almost back to the drawing board in terms of what we can do. Now, we do have the capabilities, don't get me wrong. And I do think that the current wisdom among the military space policy community is it's a deterrence one. So if they launch against us, we're going to launch against them. Here's the problem with that. There's no country more reliant on space than we. Now, in the longer term, China will, like us, become ever more dependent on space. But presently, the Chinese are not threatened when we engage in what's known as space superiority, which is the deterrence, which is, hey, eye for an eye. It's not an equal paradigm. This is the art of asymmetrical warfare we're talking about. This is China's entire stratagem. It's called the Assassin's Mace stratagem. It's all about uneven fights. The Chinese know we are more invested and more reliant on space technologies for all things than they are presently. And so in the short term, if the Chinese decide to attack our space assets, I actually think that, first of all, I do think we could retaliate, but I don't think it would have, I think it would be a negligible or relatively negligible effect on their capabilities, because they are still transitioning to a fully modern force that is uber reliant on satellites. And so I'm skeptical about the efficacy of maintaining a reliance on a response instead of a full-throated dominance model. And so, yeah, but yes, we do theoretically have the capability, but there's a reason that we're increasing the spending the way we are, specifically for space, because we know that there are dire strategic gaps, and the Chinese are filling them quite rapidly. Yes, sir.
Do we have the capability of shooting down a satellite?
Yes, we do. We've had that capability since at least the 1980s. Basically, it's an anti-satellite weapon. It's basically a glorified cruise missile, and we have launched them recently. We tested them in 2007 after the Chinese tested theirs. Basically, we have the capability to launch from an Aegis destroyer. We can launch them from ground. We can launch them also from at the bottom of an F-15 vertically and have it shoot up. Again, the problem with that is the Chinese are not as reliant. They don't have as many satellites. So we can take out all we want, and we will do damage to them. Don't get me wrong. But the threat to the near abroad of China would, I think, remain relatively the same.
Isn't the really bad actor now, Kim?
It is, but
Obviously, you stated we know where his satellites are.
Yeah.
The orbits are very predictable.
I would hope that we have, I don't know, I don't have a classified clearance, so I would hope But I think that when people hear that theory that Woolsey postulated, the people in the government, they kind of chuckle. But I don't, because I do think Kim's a Bond villain, and I think that he would do something kooky like that because it's all he's got. But we technically have that capability, and we do track them. But I don't know how serious the government takes these threats. You know, we knew generally that Al Qaeda was coming for us at least 3 to 4 years before 9/11 actually happened. And there were people in the CIA, in the government, in the FBI who were saying, these guys are going to strike. There's a great book called The Looming Tower. It's now a television, well, it's on Hulu, starring Jeff Daniels. It's a great book, great series, and it talks about how there were a handful of guys who were involved with the CT, counterterrorism operations in the 90s, and nobody would take them seriously. And then they woke up on 9/11, saw what was happening, and J. Cofer Black, George Tenet, all of these guys knew exactly what was going on because they had been tracking it for decades. It's just nobody was listening. And it's the same thing. In 1997, General Hugh Shelton said in the Quadrennial Defense Review for that year, quote, "We are open to a space-based and electronic Pearl Harbor." It was true then, it's even truer now, because the capabilities are going in the Chinese favor. And we just haven't invested properly. And the problem is also, all of this is based on education and innovation, and that requires time to mature. And so we saw 20 years ago, Chinese in particular, investing heavily in STEM education programs, science, tech, engineering, math. They didn't care about anything else. They were investing heavily in this because they knew this was the stuff of the future. And what are we witnessing today is the full flowering of these seeds that were planted 20, 30 years ago. My friend David Goldman, who writes for the Asia Times, he was the vice president, he was one of the VPs at Bank of America for many years, and he was a former Reagan administration official. He also writes under the pseudonym of Spangler, PJ Media. He talks about how he has a graph that he loves to show to people during talks. American R&D, government, federal R&D spending has dropped precipitously at the same time that China's has increased. So now we've crossed a few years ago. And this is a problem because the investments that are made today may not pan out for 20 years, but if you make them and you maintain them, they will pan out, particularly in tech and innovation. And relying entirely on the private sector, that's fine. Unfortunately, though, if the private sector had totally been in control of R&D, let's say with nuclear, we might never have had the advent, as terrible as it is, of the nuclear bomb, which did end the Second World War, at least in the Pacific theater. It was the joint public-private co-op that really helped out. And I know there's excesses there, and I know there are problems. It's not optimal. But we saw the government fully funding for years Bell Labs. And look at all the amazing things that came out of Bell Labs. It doesn't happen anymore. We're now entirely reliant on the profit, and that's fine. But when you have a system in America that is entirely dependent on the quarterly reports, you're not always going to get the big strategic picture. And so the way the Chinese view it is, yes, to make money is, to get rich is good, as Deng Xiaoping supposedly said. But they also look at it from, it's more than just the corporate side. It is a country side. It is a military, and it's a full spectrum. So, yes?
What is DARPA?
Selling. Yeah, he asked, what is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA? That's the group that really came up with the internet. They were involved a bit with the, the stealth plane, U-2, yes, thank you. The SR-71, exactly, yes. They were involved with that. DARPA, so my wife briefly worked for NIH, and her boss was also the head of DARPA, and the two of them talked. This was back in 2010, and he basically said, don't go into DARPA if they give you an offer. It's not what it used to be. And the reason is because the investment is just not there, and what they're spending their time doing is really kind of short term. A lot of drone stuff, really cool stuff, but it's not the kind of next generation research they used to pioneer because the money's not there, and the talent is going to the private sector mostly now because it pays better. And so, for instance, the DARPA relies on, or rather, the U.S. government relies on a very specific form of cybersecurity software that HP, Hewlett-Packard, developed. And it turns out the big controversy is they sold HP in order to gain contracts in Russia last year. The Russians had one requirement to gain this contract. They wanted access to the protocols for the software system that defends the Pentagon's networks, and HP sold it to them. And again, I love capitalism, but sometimes the profit motive blinds you to a larger strategic interest. I wrote an article at my website, the Weichert Report, in which I trashed DARPA because I said, where was DARPA? Why are they relying on commercial? We have a whole agency that's supposed to be advanced research projects. Why didn't they already have their own in-house cybersecurity system that would not be reliant on HP or IBM? One of my favorite stories. The wings for one of the new Boeing bombers apparently were built in China. And in the process of doing business in China, Boeing had to open up the design schematics for these new wings. Another one that I was told, there's a great book came out in 2008 by Bill Gertz called The Failure Factory. And it's full of stuff like this. And this is how, and I have a lot of friends who say, Brandon, you're overstating the China threat. This is not accurate because they're imitators, not innovators. Well, there's a great book by Oded Shankar. He's a Harvard Business School guy. And he told me, or rather, he didn't tell me, he wrote in the book Copycats, he analyzed how corporations that mimic the innovative corporations over time not only beat the innovators, but start to innovate on their own because they cut down on the time and money that was needed to make the upfront investment by copying at first and then going off on their own. China is following us. Now, Oded Shankar would probably say it doesn't apply to countries. I think he's wrong. Oded Shankar is right to point this out, but I think that it applies as much to China. And also, by the way, it applies to the United States because remember, there's a guy named, last name of I think it was William Slater. He was the father of the American textile factories in 1790s. Who was Slater? Well, over here we know him as the father of the American trades factory system. In his homeland of Great Britain, he was known as Slater the Trader because he brought advanced textile processes into the former colonies. And he gave them, in exchange for a lot of money, and he lived well in Rhode Island, he gave them the details, gave our ancestors the details for the textile factories. And by the way, those textile factories inspired Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which completely disrupted the British economy. It did a lot of good, but imitators, as we've proven in the United States, and don't mistake this, the Chinese learned at our feet. They watched us very closely. Imitators will eventually start to out-innovate the innovator.
Richard, do you have a question?
I wanted to ask how you regarded the judgment of somebody like John Bolton.
You say the judgment as in his selection or his judgment?
His judgment. What do you expect from him?
Well, I know him a little bit personally. I like him personally a lot. He is a hawk. I don't think it's fair to call him a neocon. He is a hawk. He is rather bombastic. Obviously, with Iraq, he and I would disagree on several issues. I understand where he's coming from, but I think Iraq was the greatest strategic mistake we've made in the last 50 years, hands down. I think, though, he's a signal that we're going to get tough. And I think with the combination of James Mattis, who, despite the name he's received, Mad Dog, he's actually a much more realistic foreign policy practitioner. He's not, I jokingly refer to John Bolton as Bombs Away Bolton, but Mad Dog is actually not mad. And I think he's much closer to the Kissingerian school. So I think it'll be interesting to see the two of those guys play off. My greatest fear is that we're going to replicate what happened during the W. Bush National Security Council, in which, with all due respect to Condi, we had a relatively weak national security advisor with these kind of titans of Colin Powell on one side, Don Rumsfeld on the other, and Dick Cheney. That, I'm all for the team of rivals, but you don't want to have it where there are alternative centers to reach the president. You want to keep it where they all have to kind of channel into the NSC. And so, and Bolton, my concern is that he is going to be more of an advocate than an honest broker. Thank you. But I don't know. I do think he's brilliant personally. I think he's a force to be reckoned with. But my concern is that I want a little less advocacy and a little more honest brokering. Get all sides.
Bill.
So my question is, based on your comments about North Korea maybe having the potential to holding us hostage, etc., what should we be saying to, and what should we be doing with the little rocket man right now? I mean, now, I'm not kicking the can.
Right. No, you can't kick the can down the road anymore. So that's what I think. I think we're actually in a terrible bargaining position. Our allies in South Korea do not want us to escalate. They're willing to sell their future out to prevent this. I think Kim Jong-un is beholden to an ideology known as, technically known as neo-Juche revivalism. Basically, his entire legitimacy as a regime rests on reclaiming South Korea. I think it's pretty clear that you give him any amount of time, all he needs is an ICBM that can reach the U.S., and he knows the game's over. He is about 6 to 18 months, depending on which agency you talk to. I think it's closer to 6 months. He's 6 months away from having a fully workable ICBM. And then he needs about probably 16 to 18 months to mass produce it. So that is how much time we have left. There is no deal to be made. I mean, we're really up against a corner. The hope, I think, was that China would step in. They're not. So we are now, unfortunately, in a very terrible position where we either have to attack and suffer the consequences, or basically shrug and watch as North Korea builds up this capability and then uses it on South Korea, which they will. They most definitely will. He is not operating in the same reality that other world leaders are. He has increasingly little to lose.
So what should we do? You're saying what he would do. I'm saying, what should we do? We're going to meet with him. Trump's going to talk to him.
Well, you have to meet with him. I'm not one of these people who believes you can't meet. I don't believe that. I think that you should meet. It's not a victory. But I think that we're going to get very little out of it. It'll be more delay and defer. And so at that point, I do think we should seriously entertain, unfortunately, the military option, because otherwise we do nothing. And yes?
Brandon, I want to answer this question a little.
Please.
I've just written a couple of articles about this myself, and I think that there are basically two things we need to do. One is we need to dramatically increase our missile defenses. We have only 44 interceptors based in Alaska. We should be having hundreds, if not thousands, of interceptors to defend against any type of an attack. And we deliberately dumbed down our capacity for missile defense over the years because we wanted to comply with the ABM treaty and so on and so forth. But back, you'll recall, during the Gulf War, we had those fantastic Patriot missiles that were shooting down Saddam Hussein's Scud missiles. Well, we deliberately had dumbed those down so that they would have a shorter range radar than they could have had. We could have shot those things much earlier in their flight path. What we need to do is develop, for example, I don't know what the technical name of it is, but it is a space-based launch phase interceptor. So when they're doing their ballistic missile that goes like this, and this is the launch phase right here, we need to have something up here in space that will shoot this thing down while it is in its launch phase rather than in its terminal phase, and so that all of the damage can come onto our country.
And if I may piggyback, I'm embarrassed. This is normally I do talk about this in the other talk I give, but I didn't talk about rogue states. Yeah, the space-based. So the problem is time, money and time. We should have been the minute Trump took office. I was very surprised that we were not immediately sending funds over to the military to begin developing this system in space. We are now relegated to the ground-based interceptor. There are problems with the ground-based interceptor, as Dr. Lanchowski mentioned, but furthermore, if you think about the physics of it, you're basically waiting for the missile to reach its terminal velocity, come at you, and then it's going to merge. It's going to split into all these different smaller warheads, and that makes it extremely more difficult. So you're basically launching up against gravity, and you're having to, like a bullet hitting a bullet. And then, by the way, if you don't destroy the missile fully, you may have radioactive fallout. So you could effectively have, if it hits too close to a city, you could effectively have, like a dirty bomb going off then. This is why the space-based system is the only system that will work, and we finally have the technological capabilities. We just don't have the will or the funding to do it. But the timing is the issue. So in 6 to 18 months, unless we can get a Manhattan project for space-based missile defense, we are left with either accepting North Korea's dominance of the Korean Peninsula and therefore China's, or we're going to have to engage in a very devastating military operation that I don't think we can't afford and we shouldn't want.
I wanted to mention one other thing, and this is a non-military option. When you go to war against somebody, as Clausewitz counseled, you attack the enemy's center of gravity, which is that without which the enemy cannot make war, that without which the enemy cannot survive. What is North Korea's center of gravity? In my view, it is its internal security system. It cannot survive and it cannot make war unless it has internal security. And what does it consist of? Its system of informants, its system of gulag-style prison slave labor camps. But what is really key to it, and of course that creates an atmosphere of fear. The atmosphere of fear atomizes society, which means you separate all the people within the society from one another, leaving the individual alone to contend against the omnipotent state. Then, on top of that, you've got the state's monopoly of communications and information. And that is where they control everything. Radio, TV, theater, film, education, publishing, printing, copying, everything. They control the paper supply. And then add to that monopoly of communication and information their propaganda, their ideological propaganda, which is like the drum beating for soldiers marching. It's the instrument of thought control. It's the instrument of political correctness. It is the instrument ultimately of speech control and then behavior control. Our goal has to be to break that monopoly of information and communications. And that's why radio broadcasts, why Solzhenitsyn's argument about those radio broadcasts as being the most powerful weapon we possessed in the Cold War are so vital. And it includes television, it includes internet, it includes every method of communication. And if there is a good signal in there, one way or another, then people inside, resistors inside North Korea, can try to develop somehow an underground line of communication to the West, to us. We have to help them develop that somehow, and then they can communicate with their own people. This is what the North Korean defectors recommend. And this is why, just a couple months ago, Kim came out with a new list of 10 people who are the most wanted people in North Korea. They're the 10 most wanted, or whatever it is, all slated for assassination. Several of these people are involved in international broadcasting into Korea. And this, in breaking that monopoly, and ultimately, we did a lot of things in the material sphere to help bring down the Soviet Empire. We helped bankrupt them with our military buildup. We denied them hard currency by lowering the oil prices so that they couldn't earn as much money and they couldn't buy technology. We did technology restrictions so that they couldn't acquire this, which we're not doing. We're only beginning to do against China after 30 to 40 years of actively helping China become a superpower. Right now, China has access to all of our technologies. They make 5,000 visits a year to our national laboratories, where a visit constitutes a stay of 2 weeks to 2 years. We have actively aided China in the development of 10,000 technologies. And that doesn't count the 50,000 Chinese intelligence collectors in this country, including graduate students at our major universities in the STEM departments to bring that stuff to China. So we have a huge task right now to try to to destroy the internal security system of the North Korean regime. And that is the way of winning without war. That's the way, and it may take a decade, but it was ultimately those capabilities that got 1 million people to take to the streets in Moscow. Because all the material stuff we did put pressure on them. But ultimately, what gave somebody the courage to go demonstrate against the regime when it was 90% sure that they would be arrested and sent to the gulag? Somebody has to be given the courage to do that. And you have to combat atomization, and you have to give people hope. And by the way, we should be doing the same thing to China, too.
Right. I think the club is probably a little bit anxious about getting all our lovely bodies out of here so they can get ready for the next group. But are there any other questions before we wrap this up?
Did you have a question? Yes.
Well, I just want to say thank you for this amazing.
Thank you for coming.
You were talking about maybe the Chinese government is doing in space, and, but there are also some private
Yes.
companies, and they're trying to do some collaboration among the
Yes.
three countries. Like recently, at the end of January, I attended their first international symposium on the peaceful application of space technology in human healthcare. It was attended by about 100 U.S., Chinese, and Russian astronauts and scientists to discuss sort of not the top secret
Sure.
information. It's the information that is available
Right.
to the public right now to discuss how we can basically use the space technology.
Sure, and it's important to note that China is not a monolithic entity. And there is no doubt that, particularly among the science community, it's not necessarily that the Chinese scientists working for these organizations are partaking willingly in a grand plan to displace the United States. The problem is the knowledge and capabilities that they are able to gain for potentially peaceful purposes. Space is a dual-use program. So what we have for civilian uses and what is, I think, and it is good, I think, to do some cooperation, particularly in medical, to work together, because God forbid, and this was the basis of a movie with Matt Damon, an American astronaut gets stranded on Mars, and it's actually, the Chinese scientists in the movie try to, go around their government to help because fellow scientists. So we don't want to close the lines of communication, but we do always have to be cognizant of the fact that, particularly in a system like China's, everything is state-owned for the most part, or at least the monopoly for sucking up information is state-owned, and as we've seen, the state has the capability to weaponize that information. But I do think that yes, there are actual good things that can come out of more cooperation, but we have to be much more cognizant of the fact that whatever is shared with a country like China can very easily be weaponized by the leadership, by the government. Because I do know, in fact, I know that on the diplomatic corps, there are 2 schools in China that one seeks engagement peacefully, the other one is a more nationalistic variant. The peaceful school was pretty much run out of town when Xi took over, by 2012. And so there's one preeminent, I'm forgetting his name, there's one preeminent proponent of engagement who was President Hu Jintao, the last president, who was his kind of chief strategist. He taught at Princeton for many years, but he'll be the first to, I think his name was Wang, I don't remember his name, but he'll be the first to tell you that he no longer has any influence. And pretty much anybody who was part of that school of thought is relegated to just being able, just kind of being a talking head, no real influence. And that's because there's been this real hard push. Remember Xi's background, very militarized. I mean, his background is a very military one, and he definitely has a favoring toward that side of the spectrum. And if you listen to the rhetoric, if you look at what's going on, everything that can be weaponized is potentially being weaponized in China today. But yes, there are people that are scientists, and they're just scientists. But unfortunately, a lot of these innocuous sounding things have the capability to leach into an ongoing Chinese military science research project. I mean, like I said, everything today is integrated as we've never really seen before. It's kind of one big organism. So.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.